Chapter 1. The Family Scapegoat. My name is Jenna Cole, and for most of my life, I carried a guilt so heavy it shaped every choice I made. I built a polished life far from Maple Falls, a life that looked successful from the outside, because I was trying to outrun the girl who supposedly ruined her brother's future at 20. My family let that story define me. My mother made sure it stayed alive, and I punished myself long after everyone else had forgotten. But nothing cut deeper than discovering that the truth I had been destroying myself over was never real. That the police report proving my innocence had been hidden from me by the one person who should have protected me. And from the moment I uncovered it, everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and myself began to crack open. When my phone lit up with Mom on the screen, I already knew this was not going to be a normal Wednesday. I was in my office in downtown Chicago, staring at a brief I had read so many times the words were starting to blur. The city hummed outside the window, a steady rush of traffic, sirens, and distant construction. Inside my office, everything was neat and controlled. Files stacked in labeled binders, a calendar blocked out by the half hour, life arranged into arguments and counter-arguments. It was the one space where I felt like I knew my place. I was 34, a corporate attorney in downtown Chicago, and that morning I was pacing in front of the conference room screen, rehearsing the opening of a pitch that could carry us through the next year. I answered the call and said, "Hi, Mom," trying to sound casual. Her voice came smooth and composed, the way it always became when she had already decided how the conversation would go. She talked about wedding plans for Mason, about how the guest list had grown, how the venue in Maple Falls had raised the catering estimate. She spoke as if we were simply catching up. Then she shifted and said that as Mason's sister, and as the person who had altered the course of his life back in 2010, I would be contributing $50,000 toward the wedding expenses. She called it the least I could do. She did not ask if I could. She informed me that I would. For a moment I could hear nothing except the hum of the air vents above my head. She kept talking, something about the florist and the menu, but all I heard was that number and those words, "the least you can do for what you did." I pressed my thumb and forefinger into my eyes. In Chicago, I handled contracts that shaped entire companies. I negotiated deals with executives who measured their time in thousands of dollars per hour. I was not easily shaken, but my mother had a way of folding me back into that 20-year-old girl, gripping a steering wheel on a freezing night, apologizing before anyone asked her to. I told her I would look at my finances and get back to her. She replied that I knew I was doing very well and that Mason had already been through enough, so she hoped I would not make this difficult. Then she signed off with, "Love you, honey," and hung up before I could speak. I sat there with the deadline in my ear, feeling the weight of a familiar heaviness settle over me. Maple Falls was 300 miles away, but with one phone call, it felt like I had never left. That night, as I drove home, the city lights flickering along Lakeshore Drive, I replayed the conversation again and again. $50,000. And more than the number itself, the certainty in her voice when she said it. She did not say it like a request. She said it like a debt. As I drove north out of the city limits, I turned off the radio. The silence made room for every memory I had tried to bury. I thought about the broken lamp in our living room when I was 7. Mason had thrown a ball inside, but Mom had turned to me and said, "Go get the broom, Jenna. You should have been watching where you were going." I thought about Dad's missing keys when I was 10, how he later found them in his coat pocket, but nobody brought up the apology I never got. I thought about every report card pinned to the fridge, mine quietly taped to the corner, while Mason's earned a family dinner out. You have to sacrifice for your brother. You do not want to hold him back. Her words were stitched into every year of my childhood. And then there was that night in 2010. The icy roads, the curve near the county line, the guard road that came too fast. The ambulance lights. The weight of everyone's eyes telling me I had changed my brother's life forever. I never argued. I believed them. I believed her. By the time I reached my exit, the thought I had been avoiding surfaced again, uninvited and sharp. What if everything she said about that night was not the whole truth? What if the story I had lived inside for 14 years was never mine to begin with? I stopped at a gas station and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at her newest message. Do not forget to send the transfer details this week. We need to confirm everything with the venue. Attached was a photo of Mason and Kelsey smiling in front of the country club. They looked hopeful. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Then Aunt Lydia's voice floated back to me from last Thanksgiving. She had pulled me aside on the porch and asked the question nobody else had ever dared to ask. Jenna, are you absolutely sure that night happened the way they said it did? Back then I had laughed it off. Now, sitting under the humming fluorescent lights of a gas station, her question unfolded inside me like a locked drawer finally opening. Absolutely sure? I stared at my reflection in the windshield, at the woman I had built myself into, layer by layer, out of shame and apology. And for the first time, doubt did not feel like betrayal. It felt like oxygen. And somewhere between that realization and the long road stretching toward Maple Falls, I understood that the story I had carried for 14 years might not have been the story that actually happened. Chapter 2. The Truth Hidden Since 2010. My entire adult life, every time I said yes when I wanted to say no, every time I overworked to prove I was responsible, every wire transfer I sent home when Mom called had been shaped by that lie. The drive back to Maple Falls the next morning felt strangely quiet, as if the road itself was waiting for something I had avoided for years. By Sunday evening, I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table, the same table Dad had built when I was 12. The curtains were the same blue floral ones Mom had always liked, the same flyers from the Maple Falls Community Church still pinned to the refrigerator. Time had barely touched this house. It was me who had changed. Mom moved between the stove and the counter, her movements clipped and efficient. She talked about the wedding, about the seating chart, about how Pastor Whitmore insisted on finalizing the ceremony order. Dad sat at the end of the table, quietly picking out a beer bottle label, avoiding eye contact. He always avoided eye contact when Mom took control of the room. When Mason walked in, Mom lit up. She hugged him, smoothed his hair, told him he looked tired and handsome, and that Kelsey was a lucky girl. He dropped into the chair across from me and asked how Chicago was. I gave him a few vague details about work, about a contract I was finalizing. He nodded politely. Neither of us mentioned 2010. Neither of us needed to. Dinner began in an uneasy quiet. Forks scraped plates. Glasses clinked. Then Mom set her fork down and folded her hands as if preparing a speech. She said she wanted to discuss wedding finances. She explained that venues were expensive, that photographers and bands required deposits, that the catering bill had doubled once they finalized the menu. She looked at Mason with soft sympathy and said she did not want money to be the thing that ruined his perfect day, not after everything he had already endured. Then she turned to me. She said she was grateful that I was willing to help, that after what had happened back in 2010, it meant a lot that I was ready to step up and make some of it right. She repeated that $50,000 was only a fraction of what had been lost. The word lost hung in the air like smoke. Mason shifted in his seat, cheeks coloring. Dad took a slow drink from his beer, but said nothing. Mom continued, her voice steady. You owe your brother your entire life, Jenna. I felt something inside me tilt. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The familiar script, the familiar role, the familiar guilt pressing down like a thumb on the scale. I asked, carefully, what the actual wedding budget was, whether Kelsey's parents were contributing, whether they could adjust the guest list or the menu. My voice sounded too calm, almost clinical. Mom gave a dismissive wave. Kelsey's parents are doing what they can, but this is our responsibility as a family. She said responsibility the same way she had said sacrifice when I was a child. Mason murmured that maybe they could scale back the band. Mom touched his arm and said not to worry, because his sister would come through. She looked at me with that expectant, unblinking stare. The conversation moved on, but the air had thickened around me. Every memory of being blamed, every time Mom twisted a situation to make it my fault, pressed in at once. I stared at the wood grain of the table and felt the edges of myself blur. That night, in the guest room that still had my old posters on the wall, I lay awake. Aunt Rydia's question echoed in my mind. Are you absolutely sure that night happened the way they said it did? By Sunday morning, I was back in Chicago. I sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Wendy walked in, set her files on the counter, and gave me a look that cut through my practiced composure. She asked how home was. I told her about the dinner, about the $50,000, about Mom's voice when she said, "You owe your brother your entire life." For a moment, she just watched me, then she let out a quiet breath. If you want the truth, get the accident report. Don't rely on someone else's story. The words landed with a heavy, startling clarity. In 14 years, I had never once thought about the report. I tried to brush it off. I was driving, I said. What else would it say? She tilted her head. Maybe nothing different. Maybe everything different. But you shouldn't keep paying for something you've never verified. By early afternoon, I could not focus. I grabbed my coat, told my assistant I needed to step out, and drove straight to the Wisconsin State Patrol Record Center in Madison. The building was low and square, surrounded by a lot full of cruisers and snow piles still lingering from late winter. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A clerk asked for the date, location, and names involved. I filled out the request form, my hand trembling slightly. He disappeared into the back. When he returned, he held a manila envelope. "No one's pulled this in a long time," he said. "Usually families ask right away." The envelope felt heavier than its size. I carried it to the car, shut the door, and sat for a moment staring at it. Part of me wanted to drive home without opening it. Familiar pain felt safer than unfamiliar truth. But my fingers broke the seal anyway. I slid the papers into my lap. The text wavered at first, then came into focus. Brake system failure. Manufacturer recall issued before the accident. Driver not at fault. No citation. I read the lines again and again. The world outside my car blurred. A single tear hit the page, darkening the ink. 14 years of guilt. 14 years of being the villain in my own family. 14 years of letting my mother's story overwrite the truth. I drove back to Maple Falls that evening. The report on the passenger seat. Dad was in the garage, hunched over a stool when I arrived. He looked up, startled, when he saw me holding the envelope. "I got the report," I said quietly. "It wasn't my fault." His face drained of color. He sat heavily on the stool, eyes fixed on the concrete. Harold from the station called. He he told me about the recall. The notice came in the mail. Your mother says she'd take care of it after the church fundraiser. My throat tightened. And after the accident. He swallowed hard. The officer showed me the report. I saw the brake failure. I didn't know how to tell you. Your mother said bringing it up would only cause more pain. She said we needed to focus on Mason. I stared at him. You let me believe I destroyed my brother's life? His voice broke. I was wrong. I left the garage without another word. The cold night air felt sharper than any emotion inside me. I slid into my car and shut the door, gripping the steering wheel. The story I had lived in, the guilt that had shaped my entire adulthood, had been built on silence and deception. And for the first time, that silence cracked. I inhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel until my pulse steadied. This was no longer just about guilt. It was about truth. Chapter 3. Truth as a Weapon. The drive back to Chicago felt different this time. The report sat in my bag like a live wire, humming beneath everything I thought I knew. I replayed the lines again and again in my head, while the miles blurred under my tires. Brake failure, manufacturer recall, no citation. Every word tore another seam in the story my mother had stitched around me for 14 years. The next morning, I scheduled an urgent meeting with Martin Gable, a senior attorney at my firm who had guided me more than once through complicated cases. He had the kind of steady presence that made people tell him the truth even when they did not want to. When I stepped into his office, he looked up from his desk and frowned slightly. "Jenna," he said, "you look like you haven't slept." I handed him the envelope. "I need you to read this." He opened it without a word and began scanning the pages. Once, twice, a third time slower. Finally, he set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest. "This is not just an accident report," he said quietly. "This clears you entirely." I felt something in my lungs loosen, just barely. "So I'm not imagining it." "No," he said. "This is official. The cause was mechanical failure. The recall was issued before the crash. The driver was not at fault. And the fact that your mother hid this from you?" He exhaled, long and controlled. "Jenna, under modern standards, what she did is considered emotional abuse. Financial coercion, too, if she used it to demand money from you." Even though I had known it the moment I read the words, hearing him say it felt like a blow. I stared at the document on his desk. 14 years of shame, fear, guilt, self-punishment. All of it built on a lie. "What do I do now?" I asked. He said, "That depends. What do you want? Revenge? Accountability? Closure?" I almost laughed. "I want the truth back." He nodded. "Then start by protecting yourself. Make copies. Keep them somewhere safe. And whatever you choose to do with this, make sure the decision belongs to you, not to the story they wrote for you." I thanked him and walked out of his office with the envelope clutched to my chest. In my own office, I shut the door, sat at my desk, and scanned every page. I saved the files to a private email account no one else knew. I printed 3 copies. One went into my locked drawer at the firm. One I planned to drop off at Aunt Lydia's house the next time I visited. The last I hid at home behind old case files. Quiet revenge. Truth as an armor. Truth as a weapon. Not loud or dramatic, just real. Later that week, I found myself in a negotiation meeting with one of our clients, a mid-level manufacturing company that was about to sign a renewal contract. I flipped through the clauses and something stuck out to me immediately. The opposing counsel had buried a penalty clause in the middle of a paragraph, hoping our client would not notice. It was predatory, manipulative, and subtle. I pointed at it calmly. This isn't part of the original agreement. It has to come out. The opposing attorney tried to wave it off. Standard language. Standard where? I said, and slid 3 cases across the table. Not here. By the time the meeting ended, the clause was gone, and our client was thanking me like I had just saved their company. Wendy waited for me outside the room with her arms crossed. She smirked. You always see what people try to hide. I raised an eyebrow. That's my job. Maybe, she said softly, but you should use that skill for your own life too. Her words hit deeper than she knew. That weekend, I drove back to Maple Falls, carrying the extra copies of the report. I stopped by Aunt Lydia's house first. She hugged me at the door like she had been waiting for me to show up with something heavy. In her small living room, I laid the papers on her coffee table. She read them slowly, her jaw tightening. Oh, sweetheart, I knew it didn't sit right. I asked her why. She folded her hands. Your mother grew up in a house where the oldest child was always blamed. If her brother skinned his knee, it was her fault. If something went wrong, it was because she didn't prevent it. She learned early that someone must always take the fall, and she passed that lesson on to you. The explanation felt like salt and healing at the same time. It didn't excuse anything. It just revealed another layer of the story I had never been told. I stayed with Aunt Lydia for an hour before heading across town to the old service station on Route 11. Harold Simmons was in the garage wiping his hands on a rag when he saw me pull in. He smiled. Jenna Cole, been a long time. I showed him the report. His face softened with recognition. I remember that recall, he said. Delivered certified mail. Your mother signed for it. I told your father to bring the car in, but he said they were busy with church events. I swallowed. You thought they handled it? He nodded slowly. I assumed anyone would. That confirmation struck something in me with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just that Mom hadn't told me. She knew it. She knew it before the crash. She knew it after it. And for 14 years, she had let me live inside a lie she helped create. As I left the station, a couple from my parents' church walked past on the sidewalk. The woman glanced at me, then whispered to the man beside her. I heard a fragment. Her mother said it was speeding. The lie was still alive in this town. It had seeped into the walls like dampness. When I got back to my car, my phone buzzed again. A new message from Kelsey. A digital invitation to the rehearsal dinner at Riverwalk Lodge. She hoped I could be there. She added a smiley face at the end, warm and genuine. I stared at the invitation, hearing Martin's voice in my head. Protect yourself. Choose the truth for yourself. I typed a reply. I'll be there. Not for Mom, not for the lie, not even for revenge. For the truth. For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't walking towards the Hale family narrative. I was walking out of it. And I was finally steady on my own feet. Chapter 4. The Rehearsal Dinner. The Riverwalk Lodge looked almost unreal when I pulled into the parking lot Friday evening. String lights wrapped around the stone columns, soft gold against the early dusk. Cars lined the gravel drive. People climbed out in dresses and suits, laughing, brushing off jackets, stepping into the warm glow of the building as if nothing in the world had ever weighed on them. I sat in my car for a moment, feeling my pulse beat against my ribs. Inside, the lobby smelled of lilies and polished wood. A white rose arrangement stood near the entrance beside a framed sign welcoming guests to the rehearsal dinner of Mason Hale and Kelsey Grant. Seeing my family name in elegant lettering felt like touching a bruise, beautiful on the outside, tender underneath. I handed my coat to an attendant and walked into the banquet hall. The room shimmered with gold lighting, round tables draped with cream linens, silverware arranged with precision. A small stage sat at the front, framed by strings of lights. Mom was near it, greeting guests with that polished warmth she used at church fundraisers. Her smile stayed frozen in place, bright and steady, but her eyes flicked around the room like she was scanning for imperfections. I found the seating chart pinned to a decorative board. My name sat all the way at the bottom right, table 6, far from the stage, far from family, far enough that it could be passed off as logistics, but close enough that everyone would know what it really was. I walked to my table. A few distant cousins nodded at me politely. A man I didn't recognize adjusted his tie and offered a half smile. I set my clutch down and smoothed my dress, feeling the folded accident report inside like a heartbeat. Eventually, Mom arrived at our table. Her smile softened, but only on the surface. "Glad you made it, Jenna," she said. "I know work keeps you busy. Let's try to keep tonight pleasant, all right?" I held her gaze. "I came because Kelsey asked me to." Her smile froze for a fraction of a second before she turned and floated away. Dinner was served, plates of roasted chicken and vegetables, baskets of warm bread. People chatted around me, asking polite questions about Chicago, about my job, and about how long I planned to stay in town. Their eyes slid away quickly, like they weren't sure whether I was safe to speak to for more than a moment. Halfway through dessert, Mom walked onto the stage and took the microphone. The room quieted instantly. She looked radiant, composed, in control. It reminded me of every church event she had ever orchestrated. She thanked everyone for coming. She praised Mason's resilience. She told a sweet anecdote about him as a boy, how he used to race through the backyard pretending to be a superhero. Guests laughed softly. Then her tone shifted almost imperceptibly. She said, "We are also grateful that Jenna is considering contributing $50,000 to help with the wedding. It is a meaningful gesture after everything that happened back in 2010. The words hit like a slap wrapped in silk. A few heads turned toward me. Heat crawled up my spine, my hands curled around my napkin. It was humiliation, but sharper this time, because now I knew the truth she was intentionally ignoring. I pushed my chair back and stood. The room stilled, silverware stopped, conversations froze. Mom blinked, then angled her shoulders toward me, smile still fixed in place. "Jenna, not now." But I was already walking toward the stage, my pulse steady, my clutch held tightly in my hand. I stopped a few feet from her and took a slow breath. "I need to say something." A whisper rustled across the room. Mom let out a strained laugh. "We've had a long week. Perhaps you're confused." I opened my clutch, pulled out the neatly folded report. The paper felt cool between my fingers. "I'm sorry to say this here, but I did not cause that accident." A shock wave passed through the room. Someone gasped. Someone dropped a fork. Mom's smile faltered. "Jenna, enough." That was when a familiar voice cut through the tension. Martin Gable, in a charcoal suit, stood from table 2. "May I see the microphone for a moment?" he asked. Mom hesitated, but too many eyes were watching. She handed it to him. Martin lifted the accident report. "I reviewed this document myself earlier this week. It is an official state police report from November 2010. The cause of the crash was a brake system defect. A manufacturer recall had been issued before the accident. No citation was given. The driver was not at fault." Silence blanketed the room. Every eye swung to Mom. Mason rose slowly from his seat near the front. His face had drained of all color. "Mom, you knew, didn't you?" Mom's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her silence spread through the room like spilled ink. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. Guests whispered, Someone muttered, "All these years." Aunt Marjorie stood up and said clearly, "Jenna deserves an apology." Mom stepped back, shaking her head. "I was trying to protect this family," she said, but her voice was too thin, too brittle. Dad stared at the cable in front of him, shoulders caved in. I felt no triumph, just a strange, quiet steadiness. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking softly across the floor. The soft chatter behind me grew into a swell of noise, but none of it touched me. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. The sky was a dark blue curtain stretched wide over the lodge. I took a deep breath. Footsteps approached. I turned to see Mason jogging toward me, jacket flapping, eyes shining. He stopped in front of me, chest rising and falling. I remember, in the ambulance, you were holding my hand. I always thought I imagined it. I felt my throat tighten. You were scared. I didn't want you to be alone. He stepped forward and pulled me into a hug, a real one that reached beneath years of distance and rewrote something old inside us. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have asked questions. You were a kid. You believed what you were told." He nodded against my shoulder. When he stepped back, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "I need time," he said, "to figure out how to talk to her." "I know." He looked at me for a long moment. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying it out loud." I watched him walk back inside. Then I stood in the cool night air, letting the truth settle around me like something steady and earned. For the first time, I did not feel small. I felt free. Chapter 5: Freedom. The morning of the wedding, I woke to a quiet motel room and a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't name. My dress hung on the back of the bathroom door. My phone sat face down on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, wondering if I had the strength to walk into that church after what happened at the rehearsal dinner. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mason. "Come for me, not for them." I closed my eyes. Sometimes it only takes one sentence to untangle something tight inside you. I got up, showered, put on my dress, and drove toward the Maple Falls Community Church. The building looked exactly as it had when I was a child. White siding, a small steeple, the same gravel lot, the same painted sign congratulating the newlyweds. Families stepped out of their cars dressed in their best, smoothing jackets, adjusting ties. Conversations dipped when they saw me, just for a second, before turning back into polite murmurs. Inside, the air held a faint smell of old hymnals and floor polish. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows in ribbons of soft color. I slid into a pew near the middle, not far enough back to hide, not close enough to sit with the rest of the Hales. A few minutes later, my parents walked in. Mom kept her chin lifted high, eyes straight forward, jaw set so tightly I could see the muscle moving. She did not look in my direction. Dad walked half a step behind her, shoulders slumped, gaze low. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. The ceremony began. When Kelsey walked down the aisle, Mason's face softened in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. Watching them, for a moment, all of the noise inside me quieted. When the pastor pronounced them married and they turned to walk back down the aisle, Mason glanced toward me. He didn't smile with his mouth. He smiled with his eyes. A small, relieved, grateful expression meant only for me. At the reception in the church hall, people clustered in small groups around folding tables draped with white cloth. Laughter echoed off the low ceiling, but underneath it I caught a different sound. Whispers, fragments of muted conversations. She said it was speeding. I never heard anything about a recall. I can't believe she let her daughter carry that. These were not accusations toward me this time. They were questions aimed somewhere else entirely. Mom stood near the cake table, surrounded by a few women from her church circle, but they were quiet, polite in a stiff way. Their bodies angled slightly away from her, a subtle shift but unmistakable. For a woman who built her world on image and control, those angles would hurt more than any public confrontation. I slipped outside for air. The spring breeze felt cool against my skin. I walked along the side of the building until I reached the small patch of grass beneath the maple tree. The same tree whose leaves used to fall on my hair when Dad walked us to Sunday school. Footsteps approached from behind. I turned and found Dad standing a few feet away. He cleared his throat. "Can we talk for a minute?" I nodded. He came closer, hands deep in his suit pockets, shoulders rounded in a way I had never noticed before. For the first time in years, he looked older than his age. I started looking for a therapist, someone in Madison who works with families. I've already made an appointment. I blinked, taken aback. He looked down at the grass. My silence did more harm than the accident ever did. I should have protected you. I didn't, and I am sorry for that. There was no defense in his voice, no excuses, just truth. I let out a slow breath. "Thank you for saying that." He nodded, eye shining. I hope someday we can rebuild something." I hope so too. But it will take time. I understand. He squeezed my shoulder gently, then stepped back toward the hall. When he was gone, I stood alone for a moment, letting that apology settle somewhere deep where old wounds had lived. It didn't erase the past, but it softened something sharp. I drove back to Chicago that night. The highway stretched ahead in long, quiet miles, my headlights cutting through the dark. By the time the skyline appeared in the distance, my body felt lighter than it had in years. When I opened the door to my apartment, the familiar stillness welcomed me. I set down my keys and looked around. Something about the space felt different, as if the shadows were less crowded. The next morning, I laced up my shoes and went for a run along the lakefront trail. The sunrise painted the water in pale gold. The wind stung my cheeks, but my lungs felt open and alive. For the first time since 2010, I wasn't running from anything. At work the following week, a client sent me a handwritten card thanking me again for protecting them from a deceptive contract clause. Lily from HR caught me in the hallway and said, "You know, you're stronger than they ever let you believe." It was such a simple sentence, but something inside me shifted again, this time forward. A few days later, Mason and Kelsey invited me to dinner at their apartment in Madison. Their place was small but warm, filled with plants and mismatched chairs and the smell of takeout curry. We ate and laughed and talked, And eventually the conversation softened. Mason looked down at his plate. He said, "I've been thinking a lot about that night, about everything Mom told me. I think she shaped memories for me, ones that didn't match what I actually felt." I nodded. "She did the same to me." He looked up. "I want a real relationship with you, not the one we were handed." My throat tightened. Me too. We didn't fix years of distance in that one dinner, but we opened a door that had been nailed shut for most of our lives. Back in Chicago that night, I sat on my bed with a notebook. I wrote down a list of things I owed to people. Not the imagined debts Mom pushed on me, but real ones. Respect, boundaries, honesty, choice. And at the bottom, I wrote the only line that mattered. I owe myself the truth. Mom texted a few times that week about a post-wedding brunch, and I replied that I needed space and would not be coming. I didn't explain, I didn't apologize, and for once, I didn't feel guilty. As the days passed, I realized who my real family was. Mason, Kelsey, Aunt Lydia, Wendy, Lily. People who saw me clearly, without the weight of a story that was never mine. Looking back at the girl gripping the steering wheel in 2010, I wish I could tell her that the truth would find her eventually, even if it took 14 years. And when it did, it wouldn't destroy her. It would free her. The truth didn't break my family. It broke the lie that imprisoned me for 14 years. And choosing myself was the first real freedom I ever had. If you've ever carried a burden that was never yours, your story matters.